What would you do if you saw your favorite teacher, once a symbol of strength and inspiration, reduced to living on the streets? For Barron Trump, the answer was clear. But what he uncovered about her tragic fall will leave you speechless. The wind howled through the streets of Chicago on a bitterly cold afternoon, cutting through layers of clothing like icy knives. Barron Trump sat in the back of his sleek black limousine, the warmth of the heated seats doing little to distract him from his thoughts. His success had brought him everything: wealth, power, recognition, but there was always an emptiness that seemed to linger, especially on days like this. As the car rolled to a stop at a red light, his gaze wandered outside. There, on the cracked and grimy sidewalk, he noticed a woman huddled in a thin, torn coat. Her frail figure seemed to vanish into the harsh urban landscape, her face marked by time and suffering. Something about her stopped him cold. Her presence stirred a nagging memory he couldn't place. Barron leaned closer to the window, trying to get a clearer view. The woman adjusted a tattered blanket around her shoulders, her hands trembling from the bitter wind. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met. Her sunken, hollow gaze struck a chord deep within him, triggering a flood of emotions he hadn't felt in years. Who was she? And why did she feel so painfully familiar? Barron couldn't shake the feeling that he knew the woman. As the light turned green, his driver prepared to move forward, but Barron raised a hand. "Stop the car," he said, his voice sharp but calm. Stepping out into the bitter cold, he approached the woman cautiously. The closer he got, the more certain he became this wasn't just a random stranger. Her sunken cheeks and the lines etched deep into her face spoke of years of hardship, but there was still something unmistakable in her eyes. "Ma'am," he began hesitantly, his voice faltering as he knelt down to meet her gaze. "Eleanor?" The woman flinched at the sound of her name, as if it hadn't been spoken in years. She turned her head slowly, her tired eyes narrowing in disbelief. "Barron?" she whispered, her voice raspy and weak. It hit him like a bolt of lightning. This was Eleanor Hayes, Mrs. Hayes, his high school music teacher. She had been the one who had inspired him to believe in himself, to pursue his dreams, and to never settle for less than what he deserved. Her classroom had been a sanctuary for him during some of the hardest years of his life. But now, here she was, sitting on a frozen sidewalk, completely alone. How could someone who had once been so strong and full of life end up like this? Barron's chest tightened with guilt and sorrow as the reality of her situation settled in. He knew he couldn't just walk away. Eleanor Hayes was once a pillar of her community, a dedicated music teacher at Lincoln High School in Chicago. Her classroom was a place of inspiration, where she taught not just melodies and harmonies, but also resilience, hope, and the belief that every student had the potential to achieve greatness. She lived a simple yet fulfilling life in a modest home in the suburbs with her husband, Mark. Together, they built a life rooted in love and service, raising their two sons, Ryan and Jacob. But life can be cruel, and Eleanor's world began to unravel in ways she could never have imagined. It started with Mark's sudden death in a car accident, a devastating blow that shattered the foundation of her family. Still grieving, Eleanor received another cruel twist of fate, a diagnosis of Parkinson's disease. The symptoms progressed quickly, forcing her to retire early from teaching. Her two sons initially promised to support her, but over time, their visits grew less frequent, their phone calls more distant. They had their own families, their own careers, and little patience for the demands of their mother's care. When Eleanor's medical bills piled up, she had no choice but to sell the family home to cover the costs. She believed her sons would take her in, but when she asked for help, they offered excuses and eventually silence. With no income, no home, and no family to lean on, Eleanor turned to a shelter. At first, she convinced herself it was temporary, that she would find a way to rebuild. But the shelter was chaotic and dangerous, filled with fear and desperation. Then came the fiery blaze that destroyed what little she had left, including precious photos of Mark and her boys. That's how Eleanor ended up on the streets of Chicago, reduced to scavenging for food and clinging to survival. The vibrant teacher who once inspired generations was now invisible to the world, abandoned by the very people she had once nurtured. Life had taken everything from her, leaving her with nothing but memories and a thin blanket to fight the biting cold. Barron knelt beside Eleanor, his breath visible in the cold air as he tried to process what he was seeing. The woman who had once been his greatest mentor, the teacher who had believed in him when no one else did, was now sitting on a frozen sidewalk, trembling from the unforgiving winter wind. His chest tightened with guilt and anger, not at her, but at the world for allowing someone like Eleanor Hayes to fall through the cracks. Without hesitation, he extended a hand. "Mrs. Hayes, please, come with me," he said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. Eleanor hesitated. Shame and disbelief clouded her face as she instinctively tried to smooth her disheveled hair and hide her dirty hands. I can't," she whispered, shaking her head. "I don't belong where you're going, Barron." But Barron wasn't taking no for an answer. "You've spent your life lifting others up. Now let me do the same for you," he said firmly, his hand still outstretched. Reluctantly, Eleanor placed her trembling hand in his. It was the first time in years someone had touched her without judgment or disgust. Barron helped her to her feet and guided her to his limousine. The driver opened the door without question, and Eleanor hesitated again, glancing at her reflection in the car's polished surface. The woman staring back at her was a stranger, a shadow of who she used to be. Inside the warm car, Eleanor remained silent, clutching her tattered blanket like a shield. Barron's mind raced as he glanced at her out of the corner of his eye. He couldn't ignore the frailty in her posture, the way her thin frame shivered despite the heated interior. He pulled out his phone and began making calls. His first stop was a 5-star hotel in the heart of Chicago. As they arrived, Eleanor froze again, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Barron, I can't go in there like this," she stammered, looking down at her worn clothes and dirt-covered shoes. "You can and you will," Barron said gently but firmly. "This is just the beginning." He escorted her inside, ignoring the curious stares and whispers from other guests. At the front desk, he booked the best suite available and arranged for a hot meal, fresh clothes, and a long, warm bath. That night, Eleanor slept in a bed for the first time in years. As she closed her eyes, wrapped in clean sheets and warmth, she felt something she hadn't in a long time hope. Barron, meanwhile, sat in his own room, determined to do more than just offer temporary relief. This was just the start of giving Mrs. Hayes her life back. As Eleanor slowly began to regain her strength over the next few days, Barron made it his mission to understand what had truly happened to her. Sitting across from her in the hotel suite, he gently urged her to share her story. At first, Eleanor hesitated, her voice trembling as she recounted the familiar parts: losing her husband, her illness, and the fire that destroyed her last possessions. But as she continued, the story took a darker turn. Barron's expression hardened as Eleanor revealed the ultimate betrayal. Her sons, Ryan and Jacob, had deliberately turned their backs on her. After Mark's death, she had entrusted them with the sale of her home to help cover her medical expenses. But instead of helping her, they had pocketed the money, cutting ties with her completely. At first they called, Eleanor said, her voice barely a whisper. They promised they'd figure something out, that they'd take care of me. But the calls became fewer and fewer. Eventually, they stopped altogether. When I called them, they wouldn't answer. Her hands twisted nervously in her lap as she spoke, her eyes brimming with tears. Barron sat in stunned silence, his jaw tightening as the weight of her words sank in. How could they abandon the woman who had given them everything? His chest burned with a mix of anger and heartbreak. This wasn't just neglect, it was cruelty. "Do they know where you are now?" Barron asked, his voice low but steady. Eleanor shook her head. "I stopped trying to contact them years ago. It was clear. They didn't want me in their lives." Barron clenched his fists, his mind racing. This was more than he could stomach. He had always admired Eleanor for her strength, her unwavering kindness, and her ability to inspire others. To see her betrayed so coldly lit a fire inside him. "I'm going to fix this," Barron said, his voice firm and resolute. Eleanor's eyes widened, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of justice. The days turned into weeks, and Eleanor Hayes began to look and feel like a new person. Under Barron's care, she received the medical attention she desperately needed, proper meals, and a safe, warm place to rest. The fragility in her movements began to fade, replaced by a steadiness she hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long while, Eleanor could look at herself in the mirror without flinching. Barron didn't stop at just providing for her immediate needs. He reached out to his network, pulling strings and calling in favors to help Eleanor rebuild her life. One day, he handed her a folder with an opportunity she hadn't dared to dream of: a teaching position at a local community center that offered free music lessons to underprivileged children. At first, Eleanor hesitated. "I don't know if I can do this anymore," she said softly, her hands trembling as she held the folder. Barron gave her a reassuring smile. "You've always had a gift, Mrs. Hayes. You just need to share it again. These kids need someone like you, someone who believes in them." The first day back in a classroom felt surreal. As Eleanor picked up a piece of chalk and began writing on the board, memories of her old life flooded back. The nervous chatter of children, the sound of instruments tuning, it all felt like coming home. For the first time in years, she felt purpose coursing through her veins. Her transformation wasn't just physical, it was deeply emotional. Eleanor no longer carried the weight of shame or despair. Barron had done more than help her survive, had reminded her of her worth. With every smile she saw on a student's face, Eleanor knew she was finally reclaiming her life. Weeks later, Eleanor Hayes stood in the small classroom at the community center, watching as her students played a simple melody on their instruments. The sound filled the room, imperfect but full of heart. As she smiled at the eager faces looking up at her, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Pride. Barron visited her that day, leaning against the doorframe and watching quietly. He saw the light in her eyes, the same spark of passion she had once shared with him as his teacher. When the lesson ended, Eleanor walked over to him, her voice steady and full of gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you, Barron," she said. "You already have," he replied with a warm smile. "You're proving to everyone, including yourself, that it's never too late to start over." Barron's efforts didn't stop with Eleanor. Inspired by her story, he launched a foundation to support educators and individuals who had fallen on hard times, ensuring they wouldn't be forgotten by the world they had served. The reunion between Barron and Eleanor wasn't just a coincidence. It was a powerful reminder of how small acts of kindness can transform lives. Eleanor's story, once filled with loss and despair, became a testament to resilience and hope. As they parted ways that day, Eleanor looked back at Barron with tears in her eyes. "You've given me my life back," she said softly. Barron simply nodded. "You gave me mine first." This story isn't just about Barron and Eleanor, it's a reflection of the power of compassion and gratitude in our everyday lives. One of the biggest takeaways is to always remember the people who've helped shape us, whether they were teachers, mentors, or even a stranger who offered kindness when we needed it most. Take a moment to reach out to those individuals, express your gratitude, and offer support if they ever find themselves in need. It's also a reminder to look beyond the surface when we encounter someone struggling. Everyone has a story, and often, their circumstances are the result of events beyond their control. A small act of kindness, a warm meal, a listening ear, or even a simple smile can be the beginning of a transformation for someone in need. Finally, this story challenges us to build a culture of giving back. Whether through volunteering, supporting community programs, or creating opportunities for others, we all have the power to make a difference. Life's challenges can be unpredictable, but when we choose to lift each other up, we create a world where no one is left behind. Start today, reflect, reach out, and take action. Kindness, after all, is the most enduring legacy we can leave. If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Take a moment to reflect on the people who've made a difference in your life, your teachers, mentors, friends, or even strangers. Reach out to them, show your gratitude, and remind them they're not forgotten. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this journey of redemption and compassion. Share your experiences or reflections in the comments below. Have you ever had the chance to pay it forward? Or has someone lifted you up when you needed it most? If this message resonated with you, help us spread it by liking this video and sharing it with your friends and family. Let's inspire more people to choose kindness and create a ripple effect of change in the world. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories like this, stories that remind us of the power of empathy, resilience, and hope. Together, we can make a difference, one story at a time. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. Let's keep spreading love and hope.